Some civilizations feel so ancient that people stop questioning how they actually began. India is one of them. A land of ancient scriptures, vast empires, sacred rivers, and languages older than most modern nations themselves. A civilization so deep in time that it can feel almost permanent, as if it simply emerged fully formed from the earth beneath it. But over the last few years, scientists uncovered something hidden underneath that story, something buried not in ruins or temples, but inside the human body itself. Because beneath the kingdoms, beneath the religions, beneath the myths and political narratives, there are still biological fingerprints left behind by people who survived the Ice Age, crossed continents before recorded history existed, and adapted to one of the most geographically complex regions on Earth. And what the DNA now reveals is far stranger than most people expected. The Indian subcontinent was not shaped by one civilization moving through time in isolation. It became a layered survival system, built across 50,000 years of migration, environmental pressure, adaptation, collapse, and human survival. Once you see that clearly, India stops looking like a country that simply appeared in history. It starts looking like one of the largest living archives of human survival ever discovered. And before we go deeper into this story, I want to know something first. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from. And when you think about ancient India, what is the first thing that comes to mind? Empires, religion, language, or something even older hidden underneath all of them? Stay with me. This one goes deep. Where do the people of India actually come from? On the surface, it sounds like a question with an obvious answer. India is one of the oldest continuous civilizations ever recorded. Its scriptures carry echoes of worlds that no longer exist. Its languages stretch back further than most modern nations can imagine. And yet, for as long as serious scholars have asked this question, two completely opposite answers have been at war with each other. The first story says that a group of outsiders called the Aryans swept into the subcontinent from the northwest, bringing their language, their rituals, and their social systems with them, effectively constructing Indian civilization from imported materials. The second story says the exact opposite, that India's people are entirely indigenous, that the so-called Aryans were born on Indian soil, and that civilization itself radiated outward from the subcontinent to the rest of the ancient world. For generations, these two narratives have not simply been academic disagreements. They have been political weapons, used to define identity, justify hierarchy, and draw the borders of belonging. But ancient DNA does not care about politics. And when it finally entered this argument, it did something neither side was prepared for. It showed that both stories are wrong, not partially wrong, fundamentally, structurally, irreversibly wrong. The real answer is older, stranger, and far more layered than any political narrative was ever built to contain. Because the story of India is not a story about one origin. It is a story about survival systems stacking on top of each other across deep time. And it begins not with kings or scriptures or cities, but with small bands of humans entering an unfamiliar land during the Ice Age, carrying almost nothing except memory, fire, cooperation, and the capacity to adapt faster than the environments trying to destroy them. To understand how human populations move, you have to understand the land they move across. And the Indian subcontinent is one of the most dramatically shaped pieces of geography our species has ever tried to inhabit. To the north, the Himalayas form one of the greatest natural walls on Earth, a frozen barrier that effectively seals the subcontinent from the vast interior of the Asian landmass. To the south, east, and west, the Indian Ocean closes off three sides entirely. What remains are the passes and valleys of the northwest, the narrow corridors connecting what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan to the open highways of Central Asia. This geography is not a footnote in the story, it is the story, because it means that nearly every major migration wave that ever reshaped South Asia was funneled through the same narrow entry points, compressed into the same northwestern gateway, and then released into a landscape of enormous internal diversity. The Gangetic Plain stretching across the north, the Deccan Plateau rising through the center, the Western Ghats running the length of the southwestern coast, the Thar Desert sealing off the far northwest. These interior compartments shaped everything, where people settled, where they stayed isolated for centuries, where they mixed and diverged and mixed again. In systems terms, the subcontinent functioned like a containment chamber. Migration pressure entered from one direction, encountered existing populations, and then dispersed across radically different ecological zones that each selected for different adaptive pressures. Desert populations, mountain communities, river civilizations, coastal systems, agricultural centers. And unlike regions repeatedly emptied by massive climatic collapse, South Asia maintained long-term human continuity. That continuity preserved memory, cultural memory, biological memory. And the result is what researchers today describe as one of the most genetically diverse nations on Earth, home to more than 1.4 billion people, approximately 5,000 distinct ethno-linguistic and caste communities, and a population structure carrying the imprint of migrations reaching back 50,000 years. 50,000 years ago, the Indian subcontinent looked nothing like the modern world. Sea levels were lower, the climate was unstable, large regions of Eurasia were locked in ice age conditions, and somewhere beyond the western edge of South Asia, small populations of modern humans were moving eastward after leaving Africa. These people were not explorers in the modern sense, they were survival organisms. Every movement they made was governed by water access, temperature gradients, edible plants, animal migration routes, and the constant arithmetic of starvation. Most human groups that entered new territories during this period vanished without a trace. But the humans who entered South Asia survived, and not only did they survive, they expanded across almost the entire subcontinent. Researchers today call their ancestry AASI, the Ancient Ancestral South Indians, and they became the deepest biological foundation of everything that came afterward. That matters enormously, because many people unconsciously imagine ancient hunter-gatherers as temporary populations simply waiting for civilization to replace them. But these were the humans who built the base layer of South Asia's entire genetic story. Over thousands of years, they developed survival systems specific to the subcontinent itself. Knowledge about rainfall timing, seasonal movement patterns, wild food cycles, heat adaptation, disease resistance, and the kind of distributed social memory that makes populations extraordinarily resilient across generations. One person remembers water, another remembers migration routes, another remembers danger. Once those systems stabilize across enough generations, entire populations become nearly impossible to erase. The closest living window into what this ancient population looked like genetically may be the indigenous people of the Andaman Islands, remote outposts in the Bay of Bengal that have remained largely shielded from the major migrations that reshaped mainland India. Their DNA carries proportions of AASI-related ancestry not found in quite the same form anywhere else on Earth. In a very real sense, they are carrying a biological memory from a South Asia that existed before farming, before cities, and before recorded history itself. But that world was about to be transformed, because around 10,000 years ago, another survival pressure began moving toward the subcontinent from the northwest, and this one would change everything. Around 10,000 years ago, the Ice Age was ending. Temperatures were stabilizing across the planet, and in multiple regions simultaneously, human populations were discovering something that would permanently alter the logic of survival: agriculture. For the first time in history, humans could construct predictable calorie systems instead of depending entirely on wild ecosystems. That sounds simple, but agriculture completely rewires survival logic. Hunter-gatherers survive through mobility, spreading risk across landscapes. Farmers survive through stability, concentrating resources into fixed locations. And once population density increases, everything else accelerates: disease, trade, hierarchy, technology, conflict, and eventually urbanization. In the northwest of the subcontinent, populations connected to ancient Iranian-related farming groups began interacting with the AASI-descended inhabitants already living across the region. The DNA suggests this was not a straightforward military replacement. It was slower and more complex. Migration, intermarriage, cultural exchange, knowledge transfer, and local adaptation unfolding across generations. And from that long convergence emerged one of the ancient world's most extraordinary civilizations. Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, Rakhigarhi, urban systems operating thousands of years before modern nation-states existed, with planned street grids, brick drainage infrastructure, standardized weights and measures, and long-distance trade networks reaching all the way to Mesopotamia. These cities held populations estimated between 40 and 50,000 people each. They were contemporaries of ancient Egypt, and in certain dimensions of organizational sophistication arguably more systematically advanced. But what made the Indus Valley Civilization truly remarkable was not simply its technology, it was its system's stability. A city is not just architecture, a city is a biological machine. Food must arrive continuously. Water must remain clean. Waste must leave the system. Disease must be controlled. Social trust must persist across thousands of people who will never personally know each other. And for centuries, the Indus Valley Civilization managed all of that successfully across enormous distances. Then, in 2019, researchers published the analysis of ancient DNA extracted from a 4,500-year-old skeleton found at Rakhigarhi, one of the civilization's largest urban centers. The result was striking. This individual carried no detectable steppe ancestry, none whatsoever. The migration that would eventually reshape northern India had not yet arrived. The great Bronze Age civilization was still intact, and the people living inside it had no trace of what was about to come. Far beyond the Indian subcontinent, enormous grasslands stretched across Eurasia, the Pontic-Caspian steppe, a landscape so vast it reshaped human movement across entire continents. The populations that survived there evolved under relentless pressure, extreme mobility, pastoral systems, horse culture, and the constant need for rapid long-distance adaptation. Steppe societies operated on entirely different survival logic from dense agricultural civilizations. Their survival depended on movement itself, and eventually, some of those populations began expanding outward with compounding momentum, westward into Europe and southeast towards South Asia. Roughly 4,000 years ago, as the Indus Valley Civilization entered its period of decline, steppe-descended populations moved through the passes and valleys of Central Asia and entered the subcontinent through the same northwestern gateway that had channeled migrations for tens of thousands of years before them. The genetic signature they carried matches almost exactly the same steppe ancestry profile found in Bronze Age populations of Eastern Europe. This is not a coincidence. It reflects a single dispersal event that reshaped two continents nearly simultaneously, driven by climate pressure, technological advantage, and the compounding force of populations that had already learned to move at continental scale. The languages these people spoke almost certainly belonged to the Indo-European family. When they moved west, those tongues eventually gave rise to Greek, Latin, Germanic, and Slavic languages, and ultimately to English itself. When they moved southeast into South Asia, the same language family gave rise to Sanskrit, and from Sanskrit to Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi, Bengali, and the other Indo-European languages spoken across northern India today. The reason Hindi and English share ancient grammatical roots is not poetic coincidence. It is the biological and cultural residue of a single migration that happened 4,000 years ago on the Eurasian steppe. And yet, the DNA also shows something the old invasion narratives never anticipated. This was not a conquest that erased what came before. The incoming steppe populations mixed with the IVC-descended communities still living across the northwest. The evidence suggests this process was significantly male-biased, with the steppe ancestral signal appearing more strongly in paternal lineages than maternal ones, hinting that men from steppe populations integrated into existing communities rather than entire groups displacing local societies wholesale. The result was not replacement, it was reorganization under pressure. Exactly the kind of reorganization that defines how Homo sapiens has always survived. From the mixing of steppe ancestry and IVC-descended populations in the north emerged what geneticists call ancestral North Indians, or ANI. Simultaneously, IVC-related populations who had migrated south and east during the civilization's decline mixed more heavily with communities carrying higher concentrations of ancient AASI ancestry, producing what researchers call ancestral South Indians, or ASI. These were not racial categories in any modern sense. They were dynamic mixture populations shaped by geography, migration pressure, ecological isolation, and thousands of years of survival adaptation. And for a long period, those populations continued blending with each other across the subcontinent, until something happened that froze many of those ancient layers into place with remarkable precision. Research suggests that somewhere between 1,900 and 4,200 years ago, the large-scale mixing largely stopped. Endogamy, the enforced practice of marrying within one's own community, became embedded across large portions of South Asia. The caste system, as it solidified over centuries, effectively sealed these layered ancestries into distinct social compartments. The genetic consequence of this is extraordinary and unlike almost anything else found in human population history. Communities living geographically adjacent to each other could still carry strikingly different ancestry proportions because thousands of years of endogamy had preserved ancient migration signatures inside distinct social groups. In most parts of the world, ancient migrations blur beyond recognition as populations continuously remix across generations. In South Asia, those ancient layers remained partially visible, almost like geological strata preserved inside stone. And suddenly, researchers could begin reconstructing human movement across the subcontinent with a level of detail that would be impossible almost anywhere else on Earth. The caste system was and remains a source of profound human inequality and suffering. But from a purely forensic perspective, it also inadvertently produced one of the most detailed living records of ancient human population structure ever discovered. A biological archive of migrations that happened before writing, before history, before any human institution existed to document them. The social walls built to separate people accidentally preserved one of the deepest records of how human beings moved and survived across deep time. Now consider how this evidence reshapes the old arguments. The colonial-era Aryan invasion model imagined conquering outsiders arriving to replace a passive indigenous population. But the DNA does not show replacement, it shows mixture. The original populations of South Asia were not swept away. They formed the genetic backbone of modern South Asians, North and South alike. Their descendants absorbed every incoming wave rather than disappearing beneath it. The Hindu nationalist counter-narrative insists that the people of India are entirely indigenous, shaped by no significant outside contribution. But the DNA does not support this either. The Iranian farmer-related ancestry present across the subcontinent arrived from outside. The steppe ancestry present most strongly in northern India also arrived from outside. These are ancient migrations, not recent invasions. Carrying their genetic legacy does not make anyone less Indian in any meaningful cultural or historical sense. It simply means the population history of South Asia is older and more globally connected than any closed origin story allows. What current science actually shows is something no single myth was ever built to contain. Roughly 50,000 years ago, the first modern humans to reach South Asia spread across a subcontinent their species had never touched. Thousands of years later, ancient farmers from the Iranian plateau entered the northwest and mixed with those hunter-gatherer descendants, producing the people who would raise the cities of the Indus Valley. Then 4,000 years ago, steppe pastoralists arrived through the same northwestern corridors, carrying a new ancestry and a new language family that would connect Hindi to English and Sanskrit to Russian. All of those layered populations then came together across the subcontinent in varying proportions, before endogamy gradually preserved those proportions as distinct community signatures that persist inside living people to this day. The diversity of India, its hundreds of languages, its thousands of communities, its ancient tribal groups, its north to south genetic gradient, is not an accident of geography. It is the consequence of 50,000 years of movement, adaptation, convergence, and survival on a subcontinent shaped by mountains, rivers, deserts, and ocean. Civilizations are temporary. Empires collapse, borders change. But survival systems leave fingerprints that persist for tens of thousands of years. And in South Asia, those fingerprints became one of the deepest human archives ever discovered. None of us came from one place. Modern humans are built from migrations, from collisions, from adaptation, from survival systems overlapping across time. And the people of India are carrying biological echoes from Ice Age, hunter-gatherers, ancient farming civilizations, Bronze Age steppe migrants, and countless forgotten communities that history never recorded. 50,000 years of survival still exist inside living people. That is not a footnote. That is the entire story. If this made you see India differently, you are exactly where you are supposed to be. This is Prehistoric Shadows, and there are many more hidden survival systems waiting beneath human history. Subscribe now and send this to someone who needs to see it.